Our reality is defined by four known dimensions that create two intersecting planes in a continuous line. These are commonly known as space, consisting of the three dimensions forward, back, side to side, up and down, and time, with past, future, and instantaneous present. While everyone who lives is familiar with this reality, considering we all live in it, there are many who believe in additional dimensions. Specifically, that time is not one-dimensional but two-dimensional, or potentially even three-dimensional, with the y-axis being alternative timelines or sometimes understood as alternative universes, with the misnomer of alternative dimensions. This can be seen in religion, where there often exist spaces like hell, heaven, limbo, and nirvana, sometimes understood as different names or in different combinations. This can also be seen in modern fiction, like Big Hero 6, Stranger Things, Halo, or Star Wars, and Spider-Man. In fact, a show that most people know for touching upon such ideas is Rick and Morty, which plays with manipulating different universes for one's own personal gain. However, this can be seen most importantly in books on quantum physics, like Parallel Worlds by Michio Kaku, which suggests the legitimate possibility of parallel or alternative universes, similar to how there are alternative galaxies to the Milky Way and alternative planets to Earth. Naturally, as a history major, I'm not qualified to talk about physics beyond what is understood generally, and sometimes aerodynamics because I am a plane enthusiast. It is for this reason that I'm also only going to suggest but not go over the possibility that time not only has two dimensions, but probably also a third, which is probably alternative timelines in alternative universes. Nonetheless, these ideas aren't new, although proof of them being legitimate is, relatively. This brings us to another topic, which is liminality. While in current pop culture, liminality is associated with different forms of unsettling or horrific circumstances, liminality isn't just a creepy or nostalgic feeling. Many modern representations of things as liminal, especially liminal spaces, have perpetuated this misconception by misunderstanding what liminality is. Some of those spaces, especially those inspired by the backrooms, are actually by definition liminal. However, many are not, and many more are liminal but not liminal horror. Liminality, as defined by the Merriam-Webster Dictionary, is of relating to or situated at a sensory threshold, barely perceptible or capable of eliciting a response, or of relating to or being an intermediate state, phase, or a condition. This misconception often arises because most liminal space media used as psychological horror often also serves as generally creepy or unsettling, especially if some nostalgia is involved. However, a dark room or hallway is not inherently liminal except in a literal sense if it does not inherently represent a passage between things, such as from danger to relief, known to unknown, or in many other cases, our universe to a universe beyond our own. In other words, liminal horror requires being stuck between different states, not just different locations. With that said, there are many examples of media that aren't intended to be liminal but still are, and others that intentionally instigate a feeling of liminality very well. The instigation of such liminality in media, especially for the purpose of or in tandem with horror, creates a unique form of psychological horror not often explored. It is true that some liminal media features some other horror, like monsters and villains, but this only adds to the psychological horror. Liminal horror on its own is fully realized when the subject is trapped in a liminal state or space where physical dangers are not necessarily inherent to that state, but may add to it as more imminent psychological or otherwise conventional horror, simply stacking the sources of stress on the subject to add to the horror of the media overall. In other words, not all liminal horror inherently implies or presents danger, or survival. Let's start with where I am already, VR chat. Because it's not typically thought of as liminal or horror, this is an odd place to start. However, empty lobbies, especially on popular maps, feel liminal, helped by being in VR rather than real life. This could serve as a baseline for what we mean when we mention liminality, especially in the context of horror. As the name implies, VR chat is inherently a social game and platform. You log in specifically to socialize with others, and the worlds that people create facilitate this with interesting or cozy spaces and games or puzzles to pass the time. After all, one of the main appeals of VR is being able to mostly transport yourself to settings and situations you otherwise could never experience. But considering VR chat as a social platform, what happens when you're alone? The most significant contributor to liminality in VR chat is loneliness, where it is not intended. or at least a sense of isolation. Joining an empty world, especially a popular one like the pug or the black cat, gives a unique sense that I can only describe as dread, caused by the liminality of the situation. There's no one talking. No sounds at all in most cases. This is also true of game worlds, like those with jets or other ambient noise. The effect can also be achieved by driving alone in a car world, even with the sound of the engine and driving effects. However, these last two examples are not nearly as powerful. At least in a vehicle world, the purpose of the world is not directly to socialize. The sense of isolation there only exists in that no vehicles are heard or used. In a social world, the absence of people is uniquely liminal because of the expectation of people where there aren't any. This itself is not enough to be liminal, but it feels as if you're in a place you're not supposed to be. A transitional space, from one place to the next, in this case, from a potentially but not actually social place to a definitely social place. In fact, many, myself included, may experience these worlds in this way by accident, joining empty lobbies, rather than populated ones. However, this is still VR chat. There's no real horror here from the liminality except the worlds that are specifically designed to have it. This brings us to... It's only natural when talking about liminal horror to touch upon the fandom that brought such ideas to popularity in modern culture. The Backrooms all started with an anonymous 4chan post towards the beginning of the COVID quarantine in May of 2019. However, there are many videos going over its history and lore, so I won't explain everything more than is necessary. The Backrooms as a concept is a crowdsourced liminal horror universe of sorts. Because of its popularity, there are many versions of it. The most popular are the Backrooms Wiki version and the Kane Pixels version. The Wiki version has much more to explore because it has been around longer and is often considered the Backrooms, depending on who you ask. However, I won't go into the politics of the Backrooms. Instead, let's look at what each version has to offer, seeing as they're the most common depictions of liminal horror. The Wiki version of the Backrooms has hundreds of levels, each of which involves no clipping from the previous level. In fact, getting to the Backrooms at all involves no clipping out of reality. Each level is unimaginably large, and some are infinite, each with its own inherent and often unknown danger. There are also entities in each level that hunt people, most often because people are alien to the Backrooms and are thus easy prey. In general, the danger this version of the Backrooms presents is usually environmental, though may often be physical. This is where the horror is. However, there are many levels in the Backrooms, especially level 0, the level everyone knows, where none of these dangers are present. And yet, the horror is still there. In fact, these levels are where liminal horror is at its best. The levels of the Backrooms are all in places that have familiar characteristics, often emulating or even copying what is considered the real world, our universe. What makes these spaces liminal is, much like VR chat, the distinct lack of people, working in tandem with the context of getting to the Backrooms by no-clipping. And its existence as a series of transitional realities in a seemingly linear or at least interconnected series. This is exacerbated by the vastness of the levels, and the impeding issue of survival in such a space. The danger of levels without entities or environmental hazards is the implication of such a danger, which is brought out by the liminal horror of these spaces. When presented with a mildly familiar but empty setting, a person would assume that there is a reason they are empty. They would assume that that reason is probably dangerous. Considering the means by which a person gets to the Backrooms, this is not an unreasonable assumption. Of course, on some levels there is a real danger besides starvation, in the form of anomalous entities and extreme environmental conditions. However, these operate separately from the liminal horror of being trapped in a space between spaces, or rather, a reality beyond our own. Disconnected in every conceivable way, but still showing signs of human presence in architecture, with the only means of escape being a transition between realities that defines physics as we know it. King Pixel's version of the backrooms is not unlike the wiki, except that it's focused on level 0 and some of the other earlier levels of the backrooms progression. Additionally, the concept of the backrooms is given lore. Specifically, that scientists opened a gate to it under Async Research Institute, seemingly to be used as an abundant office, living, and storage space. Unlike the wiki, this version of Level 0 does contain an entity, and it is the main monster antagonist of King's anthology. Because of the lore, this version of the backrooms is much more believable. After all, as discussed in the intro, many other works of fiction have a similar idea of some machine that opens a portal to alternative universes for various purposes. However, King Pixels uses liminal horror in tandem with more conventional horror to tell his story. Starting with the concept of isolation in a liminal space, he slowly adds the characterization of the backrooms, focusing more on its concept as a liminal space, and especially the consequences of getting lost in it. In addition, there is liminality between life and death, and to some extent to how time passes. A character who dies in the backrooms, in fact the very first to die in the first video, is later shown consumed by some fungus native to the backrooms. However, the character died in 1996, as the video description describes, but was discovered by async explorers in 1990, implying that the backrooms does not adhere to conventional laws of physics pertaining to time. It's possibly caused by some relativity stuff I don't know about, where the machine manipulates gravity to create the backrooms, or the backrooms manipulates gravity itself and is thus independent from the conventional understanding of time, but there isn't enough evidence to say for sure. Suffice it to say that this vision of the backrooms is not only liminal for existing between or beyond universes, but beyond or between space-time itself. Technically, this is something the Backrooms Wiki version does as well, but because King Pixels makes it a point to not only date the videos for when they are supposed to take place, but also give the origin of our universe's connection to the Backrooms, the Horror of Liminality in this version is much more tangible because it's made more believable. In any case, both versions are without a doubt some of the most common examples of liminal horror for their sheer popularity. However, I personally don't think that they are the best examples. After all, while the characters in both are stuck in a liminal space between universes and outside of conventional time, they're still ultimately human, and thus die when their human needs are not fulfilled. Survival against the elements is, naturally, their ultimate goal and ultimate villain in an alien space of the backrooms. But what if basic survival is removed from the equation? Dark Souls has a reputation for being an extremely difficult game for the sake of being difficult. The point of the game is to defeat enemies, and especially bosses, for the ultimate goal that drives the story but is not bound to it. Some may play for the story of defeating the Lord of Cinder and either replacing him or ending the cycle. Most play for the honor of defeating an unforgiving and difficult game. This can be said for other Souls-likes, like the sequels to Dark Souls, Demon Souls, Elden Ring, Sekiro, etc. I personally have experience with the Dark Souls trilogy, so that's what I'll refer to, especially because both its concepts and story have relevant liminal themes. The story of Dark Souls is anything but simple. A chosen undead is cursed to be reborn, or rather resurrected after death. They bear this curse because of the dark side, and after each death get closer to going hollow, which is effectively to lose one's soul and personality and become a fighting husk, hostile to everything, and especially undead who still have their humanity. This is because humanity, which is both a concept and an entity, can be used to temporarily cure hollowness, specifically by consuming it on its own or in a great soul while at a bonfire. It is specifically done at a bonfire because humanity and the bonfires are all tied to the first flame, which keeps the curse going. To make things even more confusing, souls are also a currency on their own. What is of important note, however, is this concept of going hollow, because it is essentially a liminal state between life and death. The person is no longer able to feel any emotion and has no personality or empathy, but is still unable to die. Naturally, this is why undeath is a curse. Of course, this conveniently explains enemies respawning in areas that have already been cleared. However, it also explains the players respawning, which is atypical for video games to do. Often, respawning is merely a mechanic, not a core concept in the lore. Thus, the story of Dark Souls is not only to fight bosses, but to fight them specifically to keep one's humanity intact while in a liminal state between life and death, however futile it might be, and even to attempt to end the curse in later games. Dark Souls 1 is specifically about finding the first flame, and either rekindling it after defeating Gwyn the Lord of Cinder, or letting it go out and bringing an age of darkness as the abyss consumes all. In canon, the chosen undead chooses the former and becomes the new Lord of Cinder, fighting off the abyss. Dark Souls 2 is about trying to find a cure for the curse, to end it and keep humanity indefinitely, or rather until final death. Until ultimately, in canon, the chosen undead chooses to inherit the throne of the king and queen they usurp for their souls. Finally, Dark Souls 3 is about continuing the cycle of resurrection by linking the flame once again through the defeat of 5 old Lords of Cinder, using their souls to this end. What is important to note in Dark Souls is that not only is the player character in a liminal state between life and death, fighting to keep their humanity, but they're also in a liminal space. The world of Dark Souls does not adhere to time nor to space, and this can be seen early on in some examples where kingdoms that should have long-lasting remains vanish entirely, and characters and locations transcend time on some occasions. It's most obvious in Dark Souls 2 and 3, where space-time becomes warped entirely and different times and spaces become intermeshed. In Dark Souls 2, the player character travels to different points in time to defeat bosses in the past, the souls of which make it easier to usurp the kingdom in the present, and yet the legacy of those bosses still exists in the present despite giving them an early grave. If time behaved as it should, this would have created a paradox, but it did not. In Dark Souls 3, linking and rekindling the flame keeps the abyss, an absolute and destructive true darkness, from consuming the universe in an age of darkness, making the player character a Lord of Cinder. Refusing to do so, with the Firekeeper's help, ends the Age of Fire to bring the Age of Darkness. All the while, as the flame is dying towards the end of the game, space-time is warped and distorted in a last-ditch effort to remain alive, much like an organism would fight to survive. This last example is especially interesting because some theories relating to Dark Souls 3 hypothesize that the flame of the universe in which you play in is being kept alive temporarily by flames from other universes. This ties in with the player's ability to transcend universes and invade others to help or hinder them, existing in yet another liminal state as they temporarily exist within another player's game, or rather their universe, and yet are still trapped between life and death, and also exist both in or between their universe and the others. With all of this said, the horror that comes from the liminality in Dark Souls is much like that of the backrooms. It's a horror of being unable to survive despite all of one's efforts in an inherently hostile or alien setting. However, in Dark Souls, it's not survival of the body, but rather survival of the soul, and of the universe itself. The undead must fight against going hollow by obtaining and consuming humanity to revitalize their individual flames, and the universe must be saved by undead by rekindling its flame. All the while, the undead and the universe are trapped between a state of life and death, all while time and space are rendered irrelevant by the cycle itself, which exists between or beyond them. Suffice it to say that this horror is not unlike that of trying to keep one's body alive, except that its consequences are far more severe. Losing one's body is tragic. Losing one's soul is irreversible. With how complex it is, it's no wonder most play Dark Souls for the difficulty rather than the story, and yet the story and its liminal horror are worth playing for, even if it's a bit convoluted. If you thought Dark Souls lore was complicated, you're in for a ride, because now the gloves come off. Well, not these gloves. These don't come off, but, the figure of speech that gloves come off. You get what I mean. Into the Radius is a game often called Stalker in VR for its gameplay and objectives, and is based off the book Roadside Picnic by Arkady and Boris Strugatsky. In fact, it is so much like Stalker that an overhaul of the game exists that changes some numbers to make it so. However, when the story is taken into consideration for its own merits, it's much more than just an allusion to other works. The game setting is in the Pechorsk Exclusion Zone, a quarantined portion of Russia, after an unknown disaster struck the mining town of Pechorsk in 1987, known as the Pechorsk Event. The Pechorsk Event produced or revealed the glowing orb in the sky. Those who were within the zone cannot leave without dying, and those who were outside cannot enter the zone for long, with the reasoning being somewhat vague except that some disease or radiation causes them to die after a short period of time. The United Nations Pechorsk Special Committee was created as an international effort, including Russia itself and NATO, to explore the zone, aka the titular radius. It is the player's mission to survive in this zone as Explorer 61, the 61st individual who was exposed to the Pechorsk event and recruited by the UNPSC to help explore and document the radius in order to find a cure for the terminal ailment it causes. However, it's not really this simple. The story of a catastrophe is what you're told as the player. What you see is a series of regions surrounded by fog and mostly frozen in time. People and animals are petrified and frozen in place, presumably where they were at the time of the event. Similarly, most buildings, infrastructures, and most other inanimate objects are frozen in place. The exception to this is the constantly falling ash, the player, some select supplies and items, and the anomalies and entities that inhabit the radius. Technically, some of the bodies found around the radius are also animated, or at least they were before they were killed, but there's no concrete evidence to this besides their appearance in hazmat suits rather than petrified material. Yet, time isn't entirely frozen, as a day and night cycle still exists, and so does a tide cycle, after which all items, entities, anomalies, and the player themselves are reset and randomly displaced within the regions they inhabit. In fact, the player can't die. Instead, they reincarnate and can collect their lost gear from what would be their dead body where it was killed. It's at this point it becomes obvious that in fact the radius does not take place in a Pechorsk exclusion zone, though it may be based on Pechorsk and derived from it. Instead, it is contained within a pocket dimension, or an alternative universe. Either way, that space exists between existing in our world and death, as does the player themselves. In fact, it is heavily implied that the radius exists separate from space-time altogether. Sound familiar? Deriving from its stalker influence, the gameplay of Into the Radius is simple. Kill enemies, find anomalies, complete missions involving these two tasks or retrieving objects, and survive a post-apocalyptic wasteland. However, what is unique to the Radius in terms of its enemies is that all of them actively seek to kill the player specifically, not for survival, food, or instinct, but purely to kill them. Besides the fact that there are no other people for them to hunt and attack, they are all specifically intent on killing the player, Explorer 61, with no indication of any other purpose or occupation. What is especially interesting is that all of the enemies besides the spawn are humanoid. The only other exception is the BTR, but is obviously derived from the man-made weapon of war. With their pitch-black color palette and unstable void-like appearance, they are all like shadows of humans hunting the player. However, some of them have superhuman quirks, like the slider that teleports, and the Seeker that emits short-range laser-like spikes from its head. The only exception to hunting the Explorer is anomalies, which operate passively but still exist to hinder the Explorer as hazards. Thus, everything in the radius exists to kill Explorer 61. Thanks to the constant fog, the lack of other humans to survive alongside, and this constant threat, isolation is a prominent and omnipresent theme of the radius, contributing to its liminality considering the Explorer's disposition of reincarnation. There is no escape from the radius, even in death, and yet there is no purpose to be there besides to survive. Or at least so it seems. While the deadly nature of enemies and anomalies in the radius can be swiftly explained by it being a video game, most other games, including Stalker, also have friendly NPCs that help or interact with the player. In addition to this, enemy NPCs usually have nuanced objectives that might conflict with others. In the Radius, these nuances do not exist, and friendlies are only alluded to but never present. Even the home base of Vano is devoid of life beside Explorer 61. However, the player does have the closest thing to a friendly NPC in the voice of Katya, a petrified but conscious girl who is also trapped in the Radius, but in a different way. She, like other petrified people in the Radius, cannot actively interact with the environment, though she is somehow aware of the player's actions. She communicates telepathically, talking to Explorer 61 through their mind, relaying tidbits of information about Pechorsk before the event, and existing as something of an optimistic voice along the way.
Would you want something like that? When you get out of here, I mean? Do you dream of getting out of here? Returning to normal life? I guess we don't really know what life is like beyond the zone now. But what if it's just like it used to be? People living out their lives in houses big and small. Wouldn't that be nice?
However, for all intents and purposes, the explorer is still completely alone, though with the purpose of attempting to free Katya and themselves. This relative loneliness only exacerbates the feeling of isolation that defines the radius, which in turn exacerbates its feeling of liminality.
Adding to the complications of the radius, according to notes left by previous explorers, dying in the radius has an effect on their memory, to the point that some forget who they are fundamentally as people. This adds to the growing list of similarities that Into the Radius has to Dark Souls in terms of the world and the characters in it. However, Dark Souls horror isn't derived from liminal horror alone. In fact, it's easy to miss because of the more tangible horror of extremely difficult bosses with immense power. The Radius is different. Where in Dark Souls, ending the cycle of reincarnation is ultimately the goal, in Into the Radius, there really is no goal, or rather the goal is futile and fabricated.
Explorer 61 is given a false explanation of the situation and space they are in to cover its liminal existence between reality and death, and independent of time. They are given arbitrary research missions to kill enemies, collect samples, collect lost documents, and generally explore the radius, despite the fact that the UNPSC has gone through 60 previous explorers, and, according to dates up to 2005 on some of the notes throughout the radius, at least 18 years to explore a relatively small area. Of course, Explorer 61 does not know the layout of the radius, and doesn't even know their own name, as Katya discovers when they meet. They themselves have fallen victim to the amnesia reported by other explorers, and are led down a path that is ultimately futile because there is no cure to the affliction of those who escape the radius. There is no escaping the radius. This is clear to the player if they themselves pay attention. So why play the game then, if the goal does not actually exist? Well, putting aside the surface level goal of playing the game to face a harsh post-apocalypse and shoot things in VR, there is a subliminal story to the events of the game. Despite the fact that the UNPSC misleads Explorer 61, the player, into pursuing a goal that is not actually achievable, there is still reasoning beyond the false apocalyptic background of the radius. When everything is taken into consideration, the goal of the game is futile, which will be obvious as its ending is explained. Yet every main story mission seemingly has an effect on the reality of parallels. Though the radius may exist independent of real reality, it still has a connection to it, and to the real Pachorsk. Each main mission sends the explorer to either obtain an item that might be found in the real world, or otherwise seems to have an effect on it, based on the notes left for the explorer in Vano after each mission. In the first expedition, the corresponding note reveals that the survival bracelet retrieved by Explorer 61 is actually a parallel to a coil, necessary to repair Brivome's power plant that went missing. In Total Recall, the petrified statue's memories and the note revealed that the film reel that was retrieved was supposed to be a gift for Katya that disappears, and that it contained family photos from a trip. The note also suggests that other things have been going missing. In Flash in the Dark, an unknown artifact is retrieved from a construction site in Blocky Village, and the note indicates that someone in the real world saw the glow of the gas surrounding the site, and even caught a glimpse of an armed man after having breathed the gas, presumably either the explorer or a mimic. In a probing move, the note reveals that the tape recorder taken was supposed to be a gift from the manager of Popita Factory that, like everything else, went missing. In The Intrusion, a case of papers is taken by the explorer from Popita Factory by force, and the corresponding note indicates that it is the wages of the factory which went missing. In A Farewell Feast, the explorer completes a wedding grocery list in Kalko Soraya, including food items and grenades in order to obtain a rare artifact. In fact, the voices of those attending the wedding party can be heard by the explorer in the area where the list and artifact are to be taken. The note reveals that someone brought a grenade to the actual party in the real world and killed the bride and groom with it. The author of the note also says it feels as if Pachorsk has become home to some evil power that keeps bringing misery upon us all, likely referring to the explorer as they are guided by the UNPSC. This is also the first case of murder that the Explorer 61 commits indirectly through a mission, considering that, if the enemies of the radius are human in nature, they at least can still reincarnate as well. Then there's the second to last mission, Kid's Playground. in which the explorer shines lights onto trains in the Zoraya train yard as instructed by petrified statues of children to reveal another rare artifact. Doing so reveals a train which takes the explorer back to Vano through a shortcut. The corresponding note reveals that, in the real world, a train was turned on, or at least its brakes were disengaged, killing another person by running them over. In addition to these, some of the notes scattered throughout the radius are not written by other explorers of it, but seemingly by people from the real world. All of this implies that the radius is in fact connected to the real world, and that the UNPSC is either guiding the explorer to act maliciously without them knowing, or, alternatively, is degrading the explorer psychologically by implying that the radius is connected to the real world, continuing its fabrication of hope for the explorer to escape. At the end of the game, in the final mission, Explorer 61 fights their way through one of the most difficult locations in the radius, discovering petrified statues of Katya, though not the Katya they know, but rather the memories she had from before the Pachorsk event. A sort of last-ditch effort by the radius to link itself to the real world and the story it has spun. These memories reveal that Katya had been tracking the anomalous events that befell the real Pachorsk, and that they led her to the castle, just as the explorer was led to the castle by the UNPSC. However, after getting to the top of Pachorsk Castle and finding the Grail artifact, Explorer 61 is transported to the middle of a dense forest. A giant hand clasps Katya's petrified form. The orb in the sky is much closer and smaller than before, and filled with eyes, and another petrified form resembling a combination of a slider and a seeker stands on a rock. Presumably some kind of deity, it gives the explorer a choice and a Makarov. It is revealed that Katya is a figment of the radius, unknown to even herself, and then the choice is presented. They can shoot Katya and free themselves from the radius and its cycle of resurrection. They will be transported to the real world as we know it and live a normal life. Or, alternatively, they can sacrifice themselves and save Katya by shooting the deity and sending her to the real world in exchange for being stuck in the radius. A third option, not vocalized by the deity, is for the explorer to shoot themselves, which results in the explorer being stuck in the radius, and presumably Katya as well. Based on everything the player can find in the radius, and the tidbits of information that notes reveal, it is most likely that the canon ending is that Explorer 61 sacrifices themselves to save Katya by shooting the deity or themselves. In fact, it is likely that they have done either of these up to 60 times before.
In other words, given that the radius gives reincarnated explorers amnesia and lies about its own origins and intentions, it is possible and likely that each of the 60 explorers before Explorer 61 is actually just a previous iteration of them, and in fact a previous successful iteration that freed their own Katya or whoever else the radius presented to them as an optimistic voice. This is supported not only by notes about explorers' amnesia, but also specifically a note left by an explorer who called themselves Shadow Monk. Shadow Monk notes that they feel a strong feeling of déjà vu, especially through resurrection, and explains that they feel as if they have done the same things over and over and have died over and over, but only remember actually dying and feeling it once before. In addition to this, D's notes reveal that other survivors also hear Katya telepathically, just as the explorer does. Thus, this presents the question, to what end is the explorer being subjected to this cycle? As an additional detail of the ending of Into the Radius, killing oneself instead of shooting Katya or the deity puts the player into an Iron Man mode, a more difficult mode where saves cannot be loaded and the game is set to the maximum difficulty across all options. While it can be explained as a New Game Plus, it can also explain the purpose of subjecting the explorer to a cycle of resurrection in a liminal space and state of being. To put it simply, it's to train the explorer to get stronger. Considering the implication of the explorer reincarnating 60 times before in the radius, and the implication that it is made more difficult after reincarnating if they kill themselves rather than engage in the deity's ultimatum, this then also implies that the purpose is specifically to challenge the explorer in order to train them over and over again. To what end, beyond this, is still a mystery, except maybe to unleash them upon the real world, considering the suggestion that they already have an effect on it. Nonetheless, this is a reasonable interpretation of the explorer, the radius, and its purpose under the deity who controls it. In this case, the explorer is entrapped not only in a liminal space-time reality, but also in a liminal state themselves. In yet another parallel to Dark Souls, the explorers themselves between life and death, existence and abstraction. Considering they are reincarnated continuously, they can still die, but are effectively immortal in a roundabout way. But because the radius exists independently of our reality and space-time in general, and since the deity who controls it essentially guides the player and controls them by extension, assuming they follow the guidance, the explorer exists only insofar as they can act independently. Yet, because they themselves are part of the radius, they themselves are beyond reality and do not exist in it. By extension, independent of the fact that Explorer 61 is the player, it would not be a stretch to suggest that they themselves were created by the deity as a figment of the radius, similarly to Katya, the UMPSC, and the false hope that the radius is connected to or within reality. In fact, it's even possible that the explorer isn't the only one who the radius trained, but the only one who survived, where the other humanoid enemies are corrupted explorers and survivors. Considering they still talk to some extent and can also reincarnate, similar to those who go hollow in Dark Souls, this is not an unreasonable assumption. Ultimately, Into the Radius's liminal horror comes from not only being trapped in a liminal space without escape, even in death, but from the suggestion that the explorer never existed at all, or is rather between existence and non-existence, which is only ever determined for sure if the explorer finally sacrifices Katya in one of their iterations, and is given a life in the real world as we know it. The horror is thus from the choice given to the player, whether to free Explorer 61 from the cycle and in turn dooming a fellow seemingly human and independent entity created by and trapped in the radius, or to continue the cycle and give Katya freedom from it. Yet because the game continues on after a choice is made, regardless of what choice was made, the explorer, Katya, or even both may simultaneously be trapped in the radius and exist in the real world, regardless of the player's choice. Considering the radius's abilities to manipulate at least the explorer's memory, it can't even be determined for sure if it ever truly frees either, despite the cutscene corresponding and following the player's choice, because the deity could very well fabricate the suggestion that it did. Thus, the explorer is stuck beyond space-time, between life and death, and between existence and abstraction, knowing nothing for certain, and waiting for death to erase their memory once again. In one final example, we have a film. An interesting aspect of film is that at any point you can pause a film, whether it's live action or animation, and it becomes a photograph or a drawing. La Jetée is an experimental French New Wave film created by Chris Marker in 1962. What makes it experimental is that it is almost entirely composed of photographs, not in the sense that a film is just a string of millions of photographs, but in a literal sense that frames are shown for several seconds. Though it isn't a game, La Jetée presents possibly the most pure form of liminal horror because conventional horror is almost entirely absent save for the ending.
It follows a man who, as a child during peacetime, saw another man die on a plane pier. Sometime after, a nuclear World War III begins and ends, and the evil that started it reigns over the world, conducting experiments on its subjects in underground fallout shelters, away from the wasteland post-war surface. The main character, man, is subject to one such experiment, which sends him back in time temporarily to peacetime. The objective of the experiment is to create a means of time travel to siphon resources from the past because they are scarce in the post-war present of the film. However, the man instead meets a mysterious woman, and over the course of the experiments gets closer to her. Eventually, he wakes up in her bed. In the scene in which this happens, the film takes the perspective of the man, and as tension builds, the man watches the woman wake up. For the only time in the film, she wakes up and looks at him in the eye, or rather, at the viewer in the eye, at the conventional 24 frames per second, instead of photographs as the rest of the film does. This is especially important as a scene because as the only scene with conventional film in the whole film, it draws attention to itself inherently, and then breaks through the fourth wall threshold to include the viewer as part of the film by acknowledging their presence. The film then carries on and the man is sent to the future, rather than the past, where he meets people from the future who offer the resources necessary to rebuild society and bring it from its present state of destruction and dystopia. After bringing the resources back, he is contacted again by the people of the future and offered a means of escape to the future in order to escape execution, considering he fulfilled this purpose and usefulness to the rulers of the present. Instead, he asks to be sent to the past. He is sent to the airport pier he saw as a child, and even finds the woman there as well. But is shot by one of the scientists who experimented on him. Presumably, the scientists travel back in time as well to tie up the loose end, and the person the man saw die as a child was in fact himself.
While the concept of the man dying at the end can be considered some form of conventional horror, the film overall is that of pure liminal horror because of the circumstances of the world and the man. For one thing, the conventional liminality of hallways and transcendent spaces is present throughout the film, contributing to the uneasiness of it overall. However, the world is itself between war and peace, between fascism and freedom, and, considering the present is a single point in time, between the past and the future. Considering a photograph can be considered a representation of time captured in space, it's fitting that the film is almost entirely composed of photographs, as a series of captured presents, and this is likely also intentional. However, this only makes the fourth wall break all the more impactful because the woman then transcends space-time entirely in those few seconds, existing not only in the past of the fictional world in La Jetée, but for a few seconds, also in the present of our world as she acknowledges the viewer. This simple interaction implies that the film is itself entirely a liminal space, or more accurately a liminal space-time, separated from our reality but connected to it, similar to the radius of the backrooms. This suggests that every film is its own universe, except those that explicitly share universes with their own like documentaries, or in their own like films in a saga. Being trapped there for the duration of it, this makes every film inherently liminal as a simple element of the instantaneous present, and thus a temporary transition of time like most entertainment. The woman's crossing of the fourth wall then implies that our watching of the film and committing ourselves to these independent universes is to be trapped in a liminal space outside of our own world, with only limited means of leaving it. Though obviously one is not trapped in a film's universe in a literal sense as they would be in the radius and the backrooms. Still, our investment in popular IPs and franchises can be a parallel to such a phenomenon with how invested and obsessed people can become. In any case, while La Jetée has its in-universe liminal horror that every example has had thus far, it also introduces the possibility that our lives are in themselves inherently liminal because of the fleeting concept of the present, always a temporary now. Whether we decide to transcend our universe to partake in that of another's artistic creation, or decide to do our taxes or some other crap, our lives are always in the present, and the past will always be gone, just as the future will always be just about out of our reach. Nothing is ever truly certain except for now, as much as we look for roots of stability in the details of the present and the past. Naturally, this is somewhat of a pessimistic attitude, because from this can be derived a nihilist attitude that nothing matters because nothing is certain anyway. However, that's not the case. The horror of living in the present isn't that nothing matters, because the past is still something that happened, and the future is still something that will happen, both of which have inherent value in themselves. Instead, the horror of living in the present, perpetually trapped in a liminal time, is that anything we do now cannot be undone, and that anything we don't do now will never be done. The man witnessing his own killing in La Chate can suggest that everything is fated, and that the past, present, and future are all set in stone, with the present only being a perception of the now, but with no effect on time itself. However, the man was given a choice by the people of the future. He was offered a place in the future, which would have become his new present and his new now. Everyone has this choice, whether they're in a film or in reality, and while characters of a film don't necessarily have a choice of their own, the parallels of film to our own reality suggest that they have some level of autonomy, even if it's not equal to our own. After all, the woman transcended the film, just as actors sometimes take roles into their own hands. Overall, the liminal horror of La Chate is not only a horror being trapped between war and peace, and between the past and the future, while in the past or the future. It's also a horror of our own choices, and the anxiety of the infinite possibilities that each choice could result in, because at any given moment in the present, infinite choices exist, however unreasonable, irrational, or inconceivable they may be. The best anyone can do is to make the best choice for them and others, and hope that they don't reap their own death, or others' deaths. Overall, liminal horror is an interesting concept, or even genre, because of its suggestion of the possibility of transcending space-time and existing either beyond and outside our universe, beyond and outside our timeline, or both. After all, many of us wish to transcend our circumstances into something better, whether that be our bodies, our homes, our jobs, or anything else. Being stuck in any space or time is never appealing, which is how horror and liminality usually comes about. Yet the concept of not only being stuck in a liminal space and time, but being stuck permanently, or being affected by it permanently, enhances the horror, because just as no one wants to be stuck in a space or time, no one wants to die during or after such experiences either. Some supplement liminal horror with the conventional horror monsters such spaces or times might create, and others rely on liminal horror alone, executed well. Either way, the common denominator of all liminal horror is the lack of control over one's circumstances. Conventional horror usually involves a tangible entity, and with tangibility comes weakness, however bizarre it might be. But liminality is a concept, and so it does not have weakness because it's purely a state of being. The only means of defeating it is by escaping it. But if liminal horror has anything to teach us, it's that while escaping it is ideal, it's best to avoid getting trapped in a liminal time or space in the first place. Space-time is fragile. Humanity is fragile. And people are fragile. So don't break them. In fact, don't take anything for granted, lest you go hollow.
I have been working on this video since even before the Flying Shark video was ever recorded, so I'm glad I'm finally releasing it. I hope y'all enjoyed, and I know there's some repetition of what others have said, but that's mostly because it's necessary for those who are unfamiliar with liminality and liminal horror. You know, just definitions and that sort of thing, and everyone knows that the backrooms has been done to death, so I'm sorry about that. Either way, thank you for watching, and subscribe if you want more obscure gaming opinions.